very happy to welcome here Spyros Papadatos, who is joining us today as an expert to share with us insights on democratic participation in youth sector. And Spyros is a youth worker and youth policy expert. He is former chairperson of the Advisory Council on Youth of the Council of Europe, and currently he's focusing on rural youth issues, working as the Secretary General of Rural Youth Europe. So yeah, I'm very happy and delighted to welcome you here, Spyros. And you mentioned in the information about yourself that you feel that you are shaped by international mobility, and I was just wondering if you can share, like, if you remember what was your first experience with the international mobility.
Yes, thank you, Betka, for the introduction. Actually, my very first experience was 10 years ago in my very first years of youth, when I went to my first mobility program, where I moved in Italy for the summer to volunteer as an English teacher for young children. And I really couldn't imagine, I think, 10 years ago, that I would stand here in front of you today and talk about Erasmus Plus and the youth sector. So yeah, I was shaped by the mobility programs, by Erasmus Plus, and I think it's really evident how transformative they can be as European experiences. Good morning again from my side as well, for those of you who are here today, but also to those of you who might watch the recording later. Thank you for joining today's webinar. And we're going to talk about a very exciting part of Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Core, which is the youth sector and democratic participation, specifically in the youth sector. So I like to start with a bit of an interactive moment. And we're here to talk about youth, but I want to ask you, what is youth? I understand that all of you are coming from very different realities, from different countries. So I want to invite you to write in the chat what is defined as youth in your country, which ages constitute youth. Let's see how the chat is firing up. And I see already that in Latvia, it's 13 to 30. In Croatia, it's 15 to 30. In Germany, it's 12 to 26. So already you can see some variations. 13 to 30 in Norway as well. Seven till 26 in Estonia. So very different definitions. I'm actually surprised that no one here said 18, that it starts from 18, because that's also a very dominant term that it starts from 18. In Spain, I see 15 to 30, as well in Serbia, the same. Okay, so you can already see that there are big variations when it comes to different European countries, when it comes to the definition of youth. And as you can imagine, there is no single universally recognized definition of youth, neither at the world, at the global scene, neither at the European or at the EU scene. What is youth in Ireland is very different from what is youth in Greece versus Finland versus Spain versus Slovakia. So very different realities, and that also means that there is no single standard. So youth is not recognized as a legal category. A good definition that I found is the passage from a dependent childhood to an independent adulthood. And that's a quite prominent definition that it signals like this transition period from childhood to adulthood. But in the context of Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Core, for sure, there is a definition, and that's 13 till 30 years old. And it's the same also if we look not only at the EU level, but also at the Council of Europe level, because the partnership in the field of youth of the EU and the Council of Europe also defines young people from these ages. And indeed, youth is exactly this transition from childhood to adulthood. It's a bit magical, actually, when I was first becoming acquainted with the different definitions, how childhood, for example, is really strongly defined as a legal category, and there are a lot of legal mechanisms, but things kind of change when it goes to youth. Like once you leave childhood, you automatically are considered a very different person, and everything stops. And the Council of Europe, for example, has really put efforts into this topic, especially in the transition from childhood to adulthood, especially in relation to some vulnerable groups. There was in the previous years a recommendation of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe in relation to young refugees transition from childhood to adulthood. Encouraging youth participation in democratic life in Europe is actually embedded in our TFEU, which is the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU. You can find more information in Article 165. But also, when we're talking about democratic participation and young people, it's more than just voting. Voting is seen as the more traditional way of participating, and the moment of democracy in a lot of countries, perhaps. But throughout the last few decades and years, we have seen that democratic participation has evolved beyond just voting. It comes to active citizenship, to civic engagement, and ultimately dialogue. And why is it important? We see that young people are underrepresented in formal politics. There is low voting. I think you have seen a lot of studies also at the EU level in relation to the European Parliament elections, which are happening every 5 years. You can see a lot of statistics and maybe incentives to push the youth participation percentages. And we have seen an increase in the last couple of elections at the European Parliament. But the problem of representation still remains. I was reading a study about the average age of parliamentarian in across the world. I was also reading an anecdote by the European Youth Forum that said that in the previous parliament, at least, there were more MEPs named Martin than actually young MEPs, MEPs who fall into the definition of youth. So that shows that the representation levels are still perhaps quite low when it comes to young people. And even though they're a very big part of society, they're not equally represented in the different representation mechanisms. However, we see that young people are highly engaged in more informal and grassroots or digital forms of participation. You've seen probably Fridays for Future and other grassroots movements where they gather a lot of attention from young people, strikes, protests, demonstrations, where young people are very, very active. And we see it also now in some European states. And also, when we're talking about EU policy, the EU policy exactly recognizes that. It recognizes young people as active citizens, not just future citizens. Actually, this is a narrative. When I hear young people are the future, I am quite skeptic, and I always raise it and I say, no, it's not just about the future, it's the present, because we are the citizens of today, not just of tomorrow. And also, if you want to look at it as well from a more scientific perspective, because I gave you more like the political arguments, I think the research by Farding in 2012 that compiled the different justifications for participation really encompasses the different whys, let's say, in his why youth participation study. You can see 4 different justifications. This is a compilation. It's not something that came up out of thin air. It stems from different levels and years of research. First of all, there is a right-based as number 1, which sees young people as full citizens, as rights holders, with a right to participate in decision-making that really affects them. And on the other hand, you have the states as duty bearers, which they uphold their international legal obligations. So this is the more legal, let's say, justification for participation. Then there is the empowerment one, which sees young people's participation as a tool for empowerment to sort of enhance democratic decision-making by also sharing power and shifting the balance of power between the generations, and addressing young people's marginalization and underrepresentation that I talked about before. There is also the efficiency justification, where young people's participation can produce more informed policy of practice. It really sees young people as citizens/consumers, and the services are the products that are offered to them and they consume as citizens consumers. So it also makes sense for them to have a say in relation to how satisfied or dissatisfied they are. And the last one is the developmental, where young people's participation can be used to encourage some positive youth development, because when they engage in decision making, young people can learn the social and emotional skills that are necessary for them to thrive even more as adults. So there are different justifications, and I wanted to show you this model. And next, I want to show you another model. You have already seen perhaps the infamous ladders, the ladders of participation. So in this webinar, we wanted to introduce a different one that's maybe not so known, not so mainstreamed, and that's the tree of participation. So the tree of participation is quite a recent model, I would say. You can see it in the picture, and it offers a more holistic, I would say, context-sensitive and kind of normative framework for designing and evaluating inclusive and also democratic participatory processes. So how it works like a metaphor. You can see the roots of the tree, you can see the branches, you can see the leaves. And these different parts of the tree really represent very different parts of the process. So the roots, where usually a tree starts from its roots when it starts to grow, these are the pre-process. These are the foundational enablers before participation even begins. These are safe spaces that are fostering trust. This is when it comes to the systematic inclusion of more marginalized voices, but as well the removal of the barriers when it comes to access. So for example, the cost, the language, the cultural obstacles. Then we go to the branches, which is the next thing that comes when a tree is being grown. And these are the things that are happening during the process, let's say. These are the key features during a participatory process. When it comes to equitable power sharing and the recognition of diverse knowledge, authentic and transparent communication, freedom, deliverable capacity and representation, access to resources and means to participate meaningfully. And then, of course, come the leaves, which are the post-process, and these are the elements of the post-engagement of youth participation that can sustain this empowerment. And there we're talking about accountability, so ensuring that decisions are implemented truly and faithfully, about feedback, for example, informing participants how their input was used, etc. So you will ask me, why a tree? What's wrong with a ladder? There is nothing wrong with a ladder. These are all different models for sure. But perhaps a tree can be, when we're talking about more inclusive and participatory context, a tree can be seen as a more non-hierarchical metaphor. A ladder always showcases that some things are lower, and as we go higher, or a pyramid, the same, as we go higher, it can signify more importance. Well, the tree is not associated with any kind of hierarchy. Like the roots and the branches and the trunk and the leaves are equally important. They just come with growth. They come with a more chronological order. And the tree avoids these ranking participation types, and instead it positions them as more interconnected parts of the same process. So this is a framing model I wanted to show you that perhaps is not so known as the ladders. And I have also put the link of the whole article, so you can read it yourselves if you're really interested in that. In the next part, I have included the different types of democratic participation. These are essentially the different ways to cluster them, from face-to-face versus online, from traditional to alternative, from more institutionalized to non-institutionalized, direct to indirect, top-down versus bottom-up. So there are many different ways to classify the different types of participation. These are non-binary. What fits in one category may fit also in another category. So things are very fluid in that regard. And also in the longer presentation, I have included some examples for this. And also you can find a relevant article in the SALTO participation pool that we wrote with my fellow experts who are giving this series of webinars. Next up, I want to talk about enablers. And here you may see some enablers that some of you may be super familiar with, or may seem very simple, very, maybe they don't need so much justification, explanation, but for some of you, there may be some terms that you've never encountered before. So mobility as physical mobility, moving to another country for studies or work or community work or volunteering or training. Youth work, perhaps that's something you have heard, but maybe you're not 100% sure what it is. These are essentially activities with and for young people of a social, cultural, educational, or political nature. So youth work can be an international training course or a seminar, a youth exchange in Erasmus+, European Solidarity Corps program, or just, as I told you before, my experience to move to another country and volunteer. Or when I came back to my city, I became active in a youth organization. These are all different types, different manifestations of youth work of the sort. Now, non-formal education is also something that maybe you have heard, but maybe you're not 100% sure where its lines start and end. Essentially, one definition by the EU Council of Europe Partnership or Youth says that non-formal education is any kind of educational action that takes place outside of the formal education system. And it's really, in my opinion, it's the cornerstone of youth participation and democratic participation in the field of youth, and it's closely related to youth work. And the same goes as volunteering, which is more self-explanatory. And of course, there are as well other enablers, but these are the ones that really stand out for me, and I wanted to bring them to your radar in case you're less familiar with the youth sector. And here I included also the definition of youth participation in democratic life. This I took from our wonderful youth participation strategy that I'm going to talk about it a bit later. And there we can see that youth participation is defined as individual young people and groups of young people having the right, the means, the space, the opportunity, and where necessary, the support to freely express their views, contribute to and influence societal decision-making on matters affecting them, and to be active within the democratic and civic life of our communities. And I think it's a very comprehensive definition of what youth participation is. For sure, there are other definitions and others that you may feel more correct or more closer to your realities, but I think it's a very all-encompassing one, and I really liked it. That's why I included it here. I also love quotes, and I put a quote from a good friend of mine, Dr. Howard Williamson, from his Taking Stock study that he did for the Belgian presidency of the European Union last year, where it explores the connection between youth work and youth participation, young people taking part and listening to young people's voice and views. And also brings the topic of co-management. And this is something that I would like you to keep because we're going to explore it in the last part of our input part of this webinar, but as well as the case study, the topic of co-management. Now, we're going to talk a bit more about policies and frameworks. And the first one, and probably the one you're most familiar with, arguably, is the EU Youth Strategy. This is the European Union's framework for cooperation in the youth policy. It's built around 3 slogans or 3 core words, engage, connect, and empower. And it really maps out and tries to strengthen youth participation in democratic life. And it's closely connected to our EU youth programs, Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Corps, but also the EU Youth Dialogue that we're going to also tackle at the very, not the next slide, but in the next slides. Here, I actually included the outcomes of a very recent report. I believe it came out in July. It's the interim evaluation of the 2021-2027 Erasmus Plus program and the final evaluation of the previous 7 years of the program. It tackles the long-term effects of Erasmus Plus on youth participation and citizenship. I included 4 bullet points: enhanced democratic values and civic engagement, stronger participation and active citizenship practices, European added value through cross-border experiences, and the cascading effect and new partnerships beyond individual participants. And actually, the last one is the one that is something that stands out in my eyes, because Erasmus Plus was never seen as a way to just create individual development, but it also counts a lot on what you do after you go back to your community. This cascading effect, as the Council of Europe calls it. In EU terminology, you may know it more as the multiplying effect. It creates multipliers who go back to their communities, they create partnerships, and they multiply the effect and the impact. Then we go to the EU-Youth Dialogue, which is the main youth participation system, arguably, of the European Union. It's closely related with the EU strategy, and it aims at directly shaping European youth policy. Now, the EU Dialogue is organized in cycles. These are 18-month cycles that are aligned with the trios of presidencies, the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. And each of the cycle is picking a thematic priority. It involves consultations, dialogues, and activities at the local, national, European level. And are coordinated by national working groups. In some cases, I know that national agencies are engaged or leading the national working groups of their respective countries. And every 6 months, there are EU youth conferences hosted by the at that time, current presidency of the EU, of the Council of the EU. And these are sort of the crown jewels of the EU Youth Dialogue, where they bring together also physically young people and decision makers to co-create recommendations. Right now, we're in the 11th cycle of the EU Youth Dialogue. As you know, Denmark has the presidency, and the next EU Youth Conference is actually in 10 days in Copenhagen. And it's the second EU Youth Conference of the current cycle, of the 11th cycle. And they're very connected with the EU Youth Goals. Now, the EU Youth Goals is something that maybe you have seen before or are super familiar with it. The Youth Goals are something also very dear to me, because they were developed in the 6th cycle of the EU Youth Dialogue, and was my first time as a youth delegate in that cycle. They were actually adopted, if I remember well, in the closing conference of that cycle under the presidency of Austria in Vienna. It was a shared presidency, the shared trio with Bulgaria and Estonia. And throughout the 6th cycle, around 50,000 young people took part in a survey that was Europe-wide. It ran throughout 2018, and based on that survey, the 11 youth goals were formulated. This happened with concrete scientific supervision. They were the so-called European researchers that were overviewing this perspective, and they tried to cluster the super relevant topics for European youth policy and formulate them into youth goals. And these youth goals, ever since, they have been also being part of our EU youth strategy, and you can find them there. Of course, there is also the youth participation strategy of SALTO that you have heard perhaps before in previous webinars, and it aims to work as a bridge between the EU policy and practice. And I also put here, and I wanted to put it on your radar, there's also a youth participation toolkit that is available that may be very useful for you when you're willing to implement things that we see in our youth strategy, youth participation strategy. And I also put I highlighted two of the goals of the strategy. And number 5, involvement, to encourage national agencies and other actors to involve young people in making decisions about the management and the implementation of the programs, and to take a quality approach to youth participation when doing so. And aim number 6, inclusion. Dedicate specific attention to the participation in democratic life of young people with fewer opportunities. And these also tie with what I'm going to present to you very soon, as well as the case study that we will examine later in our webinar. Now, a question also for you, young people in youth organizations. Are they beneficiaries or are they partners? Especially in the world of the youth programs, we really refer to young people in youth organizations as beneficiaries. But in my experience, also with other youth programs, with other funding programs, they're often referred to as partners. And I think this really dilemma encompasses the different principles of the respective programs. And I think it's a very interesting question to dive more into. And to dive into the question of involving target groups. And this is also the narrative. This is the argument we will be exploring later. Here I have put some arguments for the sake of involving target groups that I'm not going to go very much into, but we have also written an article again for SALTO, and you can find in the participation pool in relation to the perks of involving target groups and what it can offer in relation to different parts of youth policy work and youth participation processes. And in that regard, this is what I teased you before. This is the last part of my input, the co-management system of the Council of Europe's youth sector. So I'm sure you're familiar with the Council of Europe. It's another intergovernmental organization, very similar to the European Union in some terms, but also very different. And it has a youth sector that has been active and thriving for more than 50 years now. And the youth sector of the Council of Europe is built around the co-management structure. You can see here the co-management structure. There is the Advisory Council on Youth, which is the non-governmental actor, let's say. It gathers 30 young people who are representatives of youth organizations around Europe. And on the other hand, it has the European Steering Committee for Youth, which is the governmental actor, and it gathers representatives from the Council of Europe member states. Usually, there are people from the ministries responsible for youth from the various Council of Europe member states. And these two bodies, they compose the Joint Council on Youth of the Council of Europe, that is a co-management body that co-manages the youth sector of the Council of Europe. I have included the explanations as well in the next slide. And this Joint Council on Youth, it decides together on the youth sector's priorities, so political priorities, the program of activities, so what activities the Council of Europe Youth Department does, but also the European Youth Foundation, which is essentially a funding program of the Council of Europe that funds directly young people and youth organizations. The last content slide I have for you is in relation to the co-management system. It really puts into practice the shared decision-making. So as I explained to you, the youth sector operates through co-management. It means that young people on one hand and governments, they have an equal say. Everything works on the basis of consensus. If a person says no, the item needs to be rediscussed and there is no decision, independently if that person is the representative of a member state or the representative of a youth organization. It's considered a unique European example of structure, institutionalized youth participation. And the Council of Europe calls it a groundbreaking co-management system, which is a living example of participatory democracy. I always like this quote, so that's why I included it as well in this slide. And I finish with a quote. It's from our SALTO Participation Forum 2024 last year in Estonia by the keynote speaker, Christina Bacalso, who said in her keynote speech that to be truly participatory is also to be able to share power. And that's also what we're going to examine at our case study. We have also included some sources in case you want to explore more. First of all, for the involvement of young people in decision-making. And in the last slide, for more youth inspiration, all the relevant platforms and portals that you can find more information, research, facts, ideas relating to youth policy and youth participation from a variety of stakeholders, from SALTO, from the EU, from the Council of Europe, or from non-affiliated organizations.